Close your eyes for a moment and picture ancient Rome at the height of its glory. Imagine walking down a crowded street where merchants shout over the noise of clinking coins, where marble statues gleam in the sunlight, and where senators in flowing togas hurry past soldiers in polished armor. This was the center of the ancient world, the empire that ruled over millions, and at the head of it all sat a young emperor named Nero. Nero took the throne in 54 AD, when he was just a teenager, only 16 years old. Think about that. 16. At an age when most of us were still figuring out who we were, Nero suddenly found himself ruling the most powerful empire on earth. At first, people celebrated him. He was charming, he loved the arts, and he promised a new golden age. But as the years passed, the stories that grew around Nero weren't about justice, leadership, or wisdom. They were about scandal, extravagance, and madness. He became the emperor remembered not for what he built, but for how he supposedly lost control. And yet, there's one image, one story, that has haunted his legacy for nearly 2,000 years. It's the story of the Great Fire of Rome. In July of the year 64, a fire erupted in the city. It tore through Rome with a fury no one could stop, lasting for 6 long days and destroying most of the capital. Entire neighborhoods vanished, temples fell, and thousands were left homeless. For the people of Rome, it was nothing short of apocalyptic. And in the middle of this tragedy, rumors began to spread. The whispers said Nero wasn't rushing to help, wasn't grieving with his people. No, they said he was standing above it all, playing his lyre, singing about the ancient fall of Troy, while his own city burned to the ground. Can you picture that scene? The fire raging, the sky glowing red, families running in panic, and the emperor detached, strumming music while it all came crashing down. It's a haunting image, isn't it? Almost too haunting. Almost too perfect to be true. That's the central question. Did this really happen? Or was it a story designed to destroy him? Was Nero truly a heartless monster who entertained himself as his empire collapsed? Or was this part of a political myth crafted by his enemies? Because here's something we often forget. History is not just about facts. It's about the stories that survive. And sometimes, those stories are shaped by those who hated the man more than by the man himself. When you dig deeper, things become murkier. Ancient writers like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio describe Nero in very different ways, often decades after his death. Some claim he rushed back to Rome to organize relief efforts. They say he opened his gardens to shelter the homeless and brought in grain supplies to feed the hungry. But others insisted he was the one who ordered the fire to begin in the first place, so he could clear land for a new palace, the Golden House, a vast, glittering estate built right where the ruins lay. Which account do you believe? And this raises an even bigger question. How do we separate truth from rumor when we're looking back nearly 2 millennia? Think about how even today, in our world of instant news and social media, misinformation spreads like wildfire. One story, one meme, one accusation can completely reshape someone's reputation overnight. Now imagine Rome in the 1st century AD, where whispers traveled through crowded markets and dark alleys, and senators plotted against the emperor behind closed doors. Isn't it possible that Nero's image as the emperor who fiddled while Rome burned was more about politics than about truth? This is why Nero fascinates us. He wasn't just an emperor, he became a symbol. To some, he symbolized artistic passion gone mad. To others, he was the warning of what happens when power corrupts absolutely. And to many, he was the perfect villain, easy to hate, easy to blame. That's why the story lasted. That's why we're still telling it today. And maybe that's the real lesson hidden here. History doesn't just remember events. It remembers emotions, legends, the stories that capture imagination. Nero's reign wasn't just about governing Rome. It became about the question of how we judge leaders and how myth can outlive reality. So as we step into this journey, ask yourself, was Nero the villain we've always been told he was, strumming his lyre as his people suffered? Or was he the victim of one of history's greatest smear campaigns? The truth might be far more complicated than the legend. But one thing is certain. Once the Great Fire of Rome lit up the night, Nero's reputation was never the same again. And that's where our story begins. Picture this. It's a hot July evening in the year 64 AD. Rome, the eternal city, is alive with noise and energy. Street performers fill the squares, merchants pack the markets, and the Circus Maximus, the city's great arena, buzzes with anticipation of races and games. But somewhere in the wooden stalls that lined its edges, a small spark caught fire. At first it seemed like nothing. Fires in Rome weren't unusual. The city was built with narrow streets and tightly packed wooden houses, a recipe for disaster. But this time the flames didn't stop. They leapt from one stall to another, racing down alleys fueled by the summer winds. And before anyone could react, the fire began its deadly march across the city. For 6 terrifying days, the blaze raged almost without mercy. Eyewitnesses described walls collapsing, entire neighborhoods reduced to ashes, and families running with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Temples that had stood for centuries were swallowed by flames. Statues crumbled, roofs caved in, and the night sky glowed red as if the gods themselves had declared war on Rome. And just when people thought the nightmare was over, smaller fires flared up again. Whether these were accidents, sparks carried by the wind, or some whispered, deliberate acts, no one knew for certain. But the damage was beyond imagination. Out of the city's 14 districts, 10 were either destroyed or severely damaged. Only 4 escaped untouched. Think about that. Nearly 3/4 of Rome wiped out in less than a week. The scale of human suffering was staggering. Thousands of people were left homeless, forced to camp in open fields or huddle in ruins. Families were separated, lives uprooted in an instant. Imagine losing not just your house, but your neighborhood, your temple, your community, all gone in a cloud of smoke. Cultural treasures, ancient shrines, even the sacred hearths of Rome's gods, all reduced to ashes. What makes the Great Fire even more haunting is how we know about it. Our main sources are historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio. But here's the catch: they didn't all agree. Tacitus, writing years later, admitted that the origins of the fire were uncertain. He suggested it might have been an accident, though he carefully noted the rumors of Nero's involvement. Suetonius and Dio, however, leaned into the darker tales, writing with vivid detail about Nero's supposed indifference, and even his alleged role in starting the flames. So what do we make of this? The conflicting reports leave us in a fog of uncertainty. Was it a tragic accident, the kind that could happen in any ancient city filled with wood and fire? Or was it something more sinister, an act of arson tied to politics, ambition, or cruelty? And here's where it gets interesting. Imagine living in Rome during those days. You've just lost everything. You're hearing whispers in the streets. Some say it was fate, others claim the emperor himself wanted the fire. You don't know what to believe, but you do know this: nothing in Rome will ever be the same again. The Great Fire of 64 AD wasn't just a disaster, it was a turning point. It scarred the city, scarred its people, and set the stage for one of history's most enduring debates. What role did Nero play? Was he a ruler trying to save his city from chaos, or the villain who let it burn? This is the heart of Nero's story, because the fire wasn't only about destruction, it was about perception. And as we'll see, perception can be just as powerful as the truth. Now here's where the story gets truly fascinating, because the Great Fire of Rome wasn't just about flames. It was about how people perceived their emperor in the middle of a catastrophe. The rumor that spread like wildfire was this: while his capital was engulfed in flames, Nero stood above it all, playing his lyre and singing about the fall of Troy. Imagine that image: an emperor serenading destruction as his people screamed for their lives. To Nero's critics, this wasn't just scandalous. It was proof of cruelty, of detachment, of a man so self-absorbed that he could turn tragedy into theater. And it's no wonder that this story stuck. The comparison to Troy wasn't random. To the Romans, Troy was the ultimate tale of a city reduced to ashes, a symbol of total destruction. So the idea of Nero performing Troy's fall, while Rome burned, painted him as not just a villain, but almost a poetic one, a man so wrapped in art and ego that he blurred the line between history and performance. But here's the twist: was any of that true? The more careful historians like Tacitus offered a different picture. Tacitus tells us that when the fire first broke out, Nero wasn't even in Rome. He was at his villa in Antium, about 30 miles away. When he heard the news, he rushed back to the city and immediately began organizing relief efforts. That doesn't sound like a man lost in song. It sounds like a ruler trying to manage chaos. In fact, some of Nero's actions after the fire were genuinely helpful. He opened up his private gardens, allowing refugees to set up shelters there when they had nowhere else to go. He arranged food supplies to be distributed, trying to keep starvation from adding to the crisis. Think about that for a moment. If a modern leader opened their private estate to the public after a disaster, it would probably be praised as an act of generosity. So how do we reconcile these two pictures? Nero, the heartless performer, and Nero, the responsible organizer. The answer may lie in perspective. If you hated Nero, you saw arrogance in every move he made. If you believed in him, you saw a leader trying, however imperfectly, to help his people. And let's not forget, Nero was an emperor who adored the arts. He sang, he performed, he fancied himself more of an artist than a statesman. So even if he did perform music during the fire, or afterward, it might not have been out of cruelty but out of who he was. Perhaps he believed that singing about Troy in the face of tragedy gave meaning to suffering. Or perhaps he was simply misunderstood by a public who wanted action, not music. This is where we hit the deeper question. Do we judge Nero by the rumors that swirled, or by the records of what he actually did? And maybe even more importantly, why do we remember the rumors so much more clearly than the relief efforts? Because the truth is, history often prefers the dramatic version. The image of Nero strumming while Rome burned is unforgettable. It captures the imagination. It makes a villain easy to recognize. But the quieter truth, that he may have been a flawed man scrambling to help, doesn't make headlines. It doesn't stick in the same way. So what do we believe? Was Nero the selfish artist who turned his people's suffering into theater? Or the emperor who opened his gardens and fed the hungry? The answer, frustratingly, is that he might have been both. And maybe that's the real tragedy of Nero. Not just what happened to Rome, but how his reputation was set ablaze along with it. When the smoke finally cleared, Rome was unrecognizable. Families picked through the ashes of their homes, temples lay in ruins, and the heart of the empire looked more like a battlefield than the world's greatest city. And yet, for many Romans, the true devastation wasn't just physical, it was political. Because almost immediately suspicion turned to their emperor. Why? Well, it wasn't just the scale of the destruction, it was what came after. Within a short time, Nero began plans for something extraordinary, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. This wasn't just a palace. It was a vast, luxurious complex with sprawling gardens, artificial lakes, and golden walls designed to reflect sunlight. To the people who had just lost everything, the timing looked suspicious. Was this a coincidence? Or had Nero used the fire as a chance to clear prime land in the center of Rome for his dream project? You can imagine the whispers. The emperor wanted our homes gone. He burned the city so he could build his palace. Even if no proof existed, the very idea stuck. Because to ordinary Romans, the sight of Nero's grand golden house rising from the ruins must have felt like salt rubbed into an open wound. But Nero was no fool. He understood the danger of public opinion. He knew he needed to shift the blame, and fast. That's when he turned his attention to a small, strange, and often misunderstood group in Rome, the Christians. At the time, Christianity was still new and relatively unknown. Early Christians met in secret, refused to worship the Roman gods, and spoke of a coming kingdom not of this world. To many Romans, they seemed suspicious, almost subversive, and so when Nero accused them of setting the fire, the public found it easy to believe. The consequences were horrifying. Christians were rounded up, tortured, and executed in brutal public spectacles. Some were burned alive as human torches to light Nero's gardens at night. Others were thrown to wild animals in the arenas. It was the first major persecution of Christians in Rome, and it left scars that shaped the faith's history forever. Think about that for a moment. An entire community, blamed not because of evidence but because they were vulnerable. Different, unpopular, easy to scapegoat. Does that sound familiar? How often in history have leaders shifted blame to the weakest groups in society to protect themselves? And yet this act of cruelty had an unintended effect. Instead of silencing Christianity, it gave the movement martyrs, men and women whose courage in the face of death inspired others to join. In trying to save his reputation, Nero may have accidentally strengthened the very faith he sought to destroy. So here's the irony. Nero wanted to rebuild Rome's glory for himself, to be remembered as a golden ruler. But what history remembers most from this moment is his brutality and the birth of Christian persecution. In the ashes of the fire, his image was forever tied not to heroism, but to tyranny. So, after all of this, the destruction, the rebuilding, the rumors, one question still burns brighter than the fire itself. Did Nero actually cause it? The truth is, we don't know. And that uncertainty is what makes this story so enduring. No ancient source ever produced hard evidence that Nero ordered the fire. Tacitus, one of the most respected Roman historians, openly admitted the origins were uncertain. And yet, the suspicion lingered. growing like smoke after the flames. Why? Because of who Nero was and what he represented. Let's be honest, Nero didn't exactly make it easy for people to give him the benefit of the doubt. He loved extravagance. He poured money into lavish games, golden statues, and ambitious building projects. And then, almost immediately after the fire, he began constructing his most infamous creation, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. To the Roman people who had just lost everything, this timing looked damning. Imagine if your city burned down, and within months your leader broke ground on a glittering palace for himself right on top of the ruins. Wouldn't you be suspicious? But suspicion is not proof, and this is where history gets tricky. We have to ask, did Nero actually light the match, or was he simply guilty of bad optics? Was he a criminal mastermind, or just an emperor whose love for grandeur made him look guilty, even if he wasn't? Here's another layer to consider: politics. Nero was not well loved by Rome's elite. Senators despised him, partly for his disregard of tradition, partly because he fancied himself more of an artist than a statesman. He performed on stage, he sang, he played music, things Romans thought were beneath the dignity of an emperor. To his critics, Nero was already a joke. The fire just gave them the perfect weapon. Think about it. The story of Nero, playing music while Rome burned, is just too powerful, too poetic. Whether he actually did it or not almost doesn't matter. It symbolized everything his enemies wanted people to believe about him: careless, cruel, detached from reality. And after Nero's downfall, when the Senate declared him an enemy of the state and tried to erase his memory, these stories hardened into legend. In other words, what may have started as rumor became history. So here's the question for us today. Was Nero truly the villain of Rome's greatest tragedy? Or was he the victim of one of history's most effective smear campaigns? It wouldn't be the first time a leader's reputation was destroyed by propaganda. Think about our own times. How quickly a single narrative repeated enough can eclipse facts. How often do we prefer the dramatic version of events over the dull truth? Because the dull truth doesn't spread. The dull truth doesn't survive 2,000 years. What makes Nero so fascinating is that we may never know the full story. Was the Great Fire a random accident? The kind of disaster that could strike any city of wood and stone? Or was it part of some darker plan, tied to Nero's ambition to remake Rome in his image? Here's my perspective. Perhaps the fire itself was a tragedy, but what followed was a conspiracy, not necessarily by Nero, but against him. His enemies crafted an image so enduring that centuries later, when we hear his name, we still picture the mad emperor fiddling while his people died. That in itself is proof of how powerful storytelling can be. So maybe the real lesson isn't whether Nero lit the fire. Maybe it's how his story reminds us that reputation can be as destructive and as lasting as any flame. Ban hoi ting chem joan. Van nijken baun hiu en hai tau kak prompt. Waitu le sister maimel. Du soan kan dung va hailokrien kas prompt chotoing. So here we are. After the flames, the rumors, the accusations, and the centuries of debate, we're left with a story that is as much legend as it is history. And the image that survives above all else is unforgettable. Nero strumming his lyre while Rome burned. That single picture has become one of the most enduring symbols of corrupt leadership in all of history. Whenever we talk about rulers who ignore the suffering of their people, it's Nero's ghost that gets summoned. Politicians, writers, and even everyday commentators still use that phrase, fiddling while Rome burns, to describe leaders who are careless, out of touch, or blind to disaster. It's shorthand for failure, arrogance, and cruelty. But here's the twist. The truth behind that image is far more complicated. Because when we look closer at the ancient sources, when we strip away the drama and the centuries of retelling, we discover something surprising. Contemporary evidence suggests Nero may have acted more responsibly than the legend allows. He wasn't strumming a lyre in the middle of the fire. He wasn't even in the city when it began. He returned from his villa, opened his private gardens to the homeless, and organized food relief. Those are not the actions of a man entirely indifferent to the suffering of his people. And yet, none of that mattered, because once the story of Nero singing while Rome burned took hold, it became more powerful than any fact. This is the paradox of Nero's legacy. On the one hand, he may not have been the monster painted by his enemies. On the other hand, his extravagance, his love for performance, and his tone-deaf timing made him the perfect villain for the story people wanted to tell. He built the Golden House on the ruins of Rome, and whether or not he caused the fire, it looked like he benefited from it. He loved to present himself as an artist emperor, and to conservative Romans that looked like weakness. Combine those impressions with the fire, and the verdict was sealed. Nero would be remembered not as a savior, but as a tyrant. And that's the fascinating part about history. It's not just about what happened. It's about what people believe happened. Think about it. How many times in our own modern world have we seen a single image, a single phrase, or a single rumor define someone's entire reputation? A moment taken out of context, repeated often enough, can eclipse an entire lifetime of actions. And when it comes to Nero, the myth has been repeated so many times that it's become immortal. Whether fact or fiction, the Great Fire of 64 AD cemented Nero's place as one of Rome's most infamous rulers. His story reflects how politics, rumor, and tragedy can intertwine to shape historical memory. The senators who hated him, the historians who recorded the tales, the Christian writers who remembered his persecution. All of them contributed to an image that may tell us more about human storytelling than about Nero himself. So where does that leave us? Was Nero a reckless tyrant blinded by ambition, or a victim of one of history's greatest smear campaigns? The truth may lie somewhere in between. Perhaps he was a man of contradictions, capable of both cruelty and compassion, both artistry and arrogance. A man who wanted to be remembered as a performer, but ended up remembered as a monster. And maybe that's what makes his story so compelling even today, because Nero forces us to ask uncomfortable questions, not just about him, but about ourselves. How do we judge our leaders? Do we look at the facts, or do we cling to the stories that feel the most dramatic? Do we prefer truth or legend? The reality is, history often remembers villains more vividly than heroes. It's not because villains were always worse, but because their stories carry the weight of caution. They become symbols of what not to do, of the dangers of unchecked power, of what happens when rulers lose touch with their people. In that sense, Nero's myth has outlived him by design. He became not just a man, but a warning. And yet I can't help but wonder, what if Nero had lived in our time? What if social media had captured him rushing back from Antium, opening his gardens, handing out bread? Would that have saved his reputation? Or would the meme of Nero playing while Rome burned still have drowned out everything else? That's the open question we're left with. The story of Nero is not just about Rome. It's about how humans remember, how we shape narratives, and how myths can become more powerful than the facts. In the end, maybe Nero's greatest tragedy wasn't the fire that destroyed his city. Maybe his greatest tragedy was that the fire also destroyed his legacy. Because once an emperor is immortalized in legend, the man himself disappears. And Nero, for better or worse, will forever be remembered as the emperor who watched while Rome turned to ash.